All right. Well, good morning, evening, or afternoon, depending where you are. So glad to have so many folks join us for another thought leader session from Disruptor League. Our guest of honor today is Shilpi Kumar, who's asking the question, what are the myths of innovation? Things for us to be aware of. And yeah, I think we're going to have a really good discussion because she's got some really interesting thoughts around innovation and where it goes wrong and how we can help it go better. Okay, so let's do this. Hopefully everybody had a chance to have a look at the video that we put into the meeting invitation. If you haven't, that's okay. We're gonna put those up right now and go over what are the myths of innovation. And then Browner, as folks get in, if you don't mind, just admit them, please. All right, so let me share the myths with all of you. Okay, so again, we're gonna dive into these in just a second, but yeah, before I go in, let me just read a description of exactly what it is we're going to talk about. So innovation. 4 in 5 CEOs say that they want their employees to feel empowered to innovate without worrying about negative consequences. Yet innovation remains among the biggest challenges that business leaders face globally. It's absolutely true. We've probably all seen this. So Shilpi and her colleagues asked business leaders across the globe what they thought, asked business leaders across the globe what they thought qualified as innovation, what their organizations were doing to support innovation, and what was slowing them down. They soon learned that innovation has different meanings to different communities, cultures, and mindsets. What emerged from their conversations was an understanding of what was not innovation and a narrative they call the myths of innovation and detangling them. In this session, Shilpi will present their research and discuss the myths that they unearthed, some of which you may even hold. So I think that'll be interesting. So with that as introduction, Shilpi, if you don't mind, go ahead and give us a little introduction. And while Shilpi's talking, I'll put a poll out for folks, because to have a really good, rich discussion, we probably can't go into detail in all of 7 of these, but I want the folks who've joined us to have a real say into how the conversation goes. So we'll ask folks to put their 2 or 3 myths that they'd most like us to discuss together. So with that, Shilpi, go ahead and give us a little introduction about you.
Great, yeah, thanks. I'm excited to be part of this discussion. This is a topic that I've been thinking about more closely for a long time. In fact, just to give you a little background, I am an architect by undergrad. I did my industrial design and then did my master's in design methods, which was really focused on helping businesses think of business methods as a way to bridge the design and business around together. So, many people call it design thinking, or, really taking a more human-centered approach to making even business decisions. So that's been my focus. And ever since I worked with large to mid to large organizations. So spent some time at Herman Miller leading their generative research, to GE, General Electric, where I was part of leading their customer experience initiative and helping bring research-based approach, but then also looking at helping them in governance issues with innovation. And I think that's where I really got interested in this idea of innovation as a process versus innovation as an idea, or a new thing that adds value to people. I thought, within my experience, it's always been, and maybe because I come from a design background, that the ideas have always been easier to generate But I mean, it's not absolutely easy, but it's easier than actually taking it forward and actually launching and making sure your users adopt the idea as a whole. So, um, and that's why I got interested in what, if you think of innovation as a flow of ideas across an organization, there are too many bottlenecks, and it could be because of silos in the organization, or miscommunication, loss in translation of information, all those reasons that have happened or happens in any big or small organization. And it's interesting when you're in a corporation and working as part of a small discipline, you think that is your world. But when you step out and look at multiple organizations, at least I never thought that was a problem for every organization. And that's when in 2018, I started Coach Lab and Coach is an Indian word, a Hindi word for discovery. And I believed, discovery is the essence of innovation and opportunities, new opportunities. So I started Coach Lab based out of Chicago. We're still based out of Chicago. And now we operate across the globe in terms of how the client, depending on the client and where they're trying to discover. But we are, I started reading a lot of books on innovation governance and all of that. And I think the biggest thing that triggered my move to this area and expertise is looking at how can we design organizations that are human-centered, right? If we think of organizations as designing them human-centered, then there's more empathy within the organization, there's more transparency, there's visibility, and there's more coordination, right? All of these, but there isn't, there's a big problem of innovation flow and how ideas flow, and there's a lot of disruptions and bottlenecks. So, and in 2018, when I started Coach Lab, that's when I started interviewing leaders across the globe, asking them simple questions. What is innovation? What is design? How is it different? What is invention? How is invention? And all those questions that I had, how is design thinking? How does it work together? What's agile transformation? What's digital transformation? So I had all these questions that, for me, it was just a fun project to ask these questions and try to make sense of it for me and for my organization, which is Coach Lab. And we clearly, like Kevin introduced the myths, we thought we will have a clear kind of narrative on what's innovation and what it means to them and all of that. That's what we thought we would start out with. But when we heard these people and thought leaders who some of them have been very successful with it, some of them have failed or are struggling with it, it was all across, we understood that what was very clear is what's not innovation. And it was easier to comprehend and tell that story around things that a lot of organizations surprisingly believe that they're being innovative and they're doing innovation, they're practicing innovation, but actually it's not. It's not. And that's a big problem. That's holding them back from what they could otherwise be doing very well. I mean, so that's what took form of these 7 myths. So it's just a quick introduction of what these are. And these are, I think, though we focus the video on India as a market, but most of my US clients, they all relate to it. And I think it's happening in every organization in pieces and parts. And I think my goal is whether you're an individual contributor, researcher, designer, strategist, you're a UX designer, like whoever you are, or a leader or a CEO of the company. I think at every level, there's something you can do each day that can help bust that myth. Right. So I'm going to not further leave some discussion opportunities for you to ask and see based on the myth as well. So is that helpful, Kevin? Yeah.
That is very helpful and a great introduction. And so I've noticed a couple folks already using the chat function. We want to invite you, as we're having this discussion, if you have questions, for sure, put those into the chat, and we'll come back to as many as we can. I can promise you that much. So quick update on the poll. I have to tell you, Shilpi, a lot of interest in all these topics. So there's no runaway winner, but the top voter, top vote getter, in terms of what are the myths of innovation that we want to focus on. Number one is number three, that digital transformation is innovation. The second one is innovation is that one bright idea.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was a three-way tie for third. So let's kind of, I guess, I'll give you an idea of what those are. So innovation is expensive. Innovation has immediate ROI, and innovation is a one-time act. Those were a three-way tie for the third topic. So I feel like just based on the results here, Shilpi, you've hit on a lot of nerves with people that they really want to get into and dig into and talk about. So I guess it's really interesting to me the way that you frame this is, so it sounds like you noticed that there are a lot of leaders say that innovation is important. But it sounds like in a lot of cases, I'm betting a lot of the folks here have seen this. They don't always walk the talk, right? So they're not necessarily putting the processes and the people into place to actually deliver on what they say is important. But I'm really curious about that journey of setting out to understand what is innovation and coming out with what is it not. Tell me a little bit about, as you were talking to folks, how you said, we need to just change the way that we're even thinking about this.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. For example, my first, I was at GE at the time when I decided to start the company, and the first person I asked, "So, what is innovation to you?" And it was very natural. Invention was innovation to them, right? Because GE comes from a culture of experimentation to invent new things, right? They come from an R&D model, which is really developed on creating new inventions. So I think invention is innovation, but it's a more, innovation is broader, right? Like you can have something that's not totally new. It could be existing in different ways in different markets, and you could connect those two, three ideas and put in a new business model, and that could be innovation, right? So I think it depends on who you talk to. It is different, but I think one thing, the way I simplify what innovation is now, it has to be unique, new, and I think very important is that it adds value to people's life, and it adds value to the business. Because okay, as innovators, we are observing and looking for new opportunities. That's not enough, because business is not working on charity, right? We have to make money in the end, and we have to prove that to the business leaders to make sure they meet their numbers. So it's really important to balance that, and to say that just because it's desirable by the people doesn't mean that it is a good opportunity for the business. So and oftentimes that's a big disconnect, right? Designers will come and say, researchers will come and say, this is huge thing, why can't the business develop that? But are you aligned with the strategy or growth strategy of the business, right? And I think that's often a misalignment. And does the organization have a growth mindset? Are they looking at, I mean, chief growth officer is still a newer concept. Like a lot of organizations don't think of, when they think of investing in innovation, that it is for growth. They're just doing it because it's a thing to do. It's every organization has to do innovation, and they're frustrated because they're hoping for immediate return, and that's not the right expectation. That shouldn't be the right expectation.
Absolutely. So let's dig into some of these myths even deeper. So I think we can cover a lot of what you just talked in great detail for sure. So going to the digital transformation is innovation. I guess, I'm sure that you've seen some examples where manual processes were perhaps digitized and then rolled out as, well, this is innovative. I guess, Um, I guess tell me a little bit about how innovation and solving the problem um, hasn't necessarily always been part of the equation in
Right.
digitizing and going with digital.
So a lot of organizations, in the name of digital transformation, it's part of their innovation, or innovation is part of digital transformation. And um, I think they confuse it a bit, right? Like, um, uh, give you an example. When you're digitizing something, right? Let's say it's a banking process, or it's a supply chain logistic process, and there are lots of tons of manual processes, and it could be it when you're digitizing, you're also digitizing the redundancies. You're
Mm.
digitizing processes as it is. That's not innovation in my mind. Innovation is when you're really thinking about the people who are using the system, the different primary and secondary scale stakeholders who are involved in the system, and seeing how can we make it easy and efficient, and how can we look at some cost savings in that process. What does it mean to the different businesses who are involved in that supply chain? What are the third party integrations within that complete the system? So one of the frameworks we often use is called a service blueprint, where we actually map the customer experience journey, and connect it with the touch all the touch points that the digital layer kind of supports, or and also the behind the scene things that you can't really see, but there are systems that
Hmm.
enable those touch points, right? So that's a way to really take a more research driven approach, a more holistic approach, to keeping the people, the process, and the purpose in mind. And that's a different mindset than just digitizing something to make it just upgrade it. And I think sometimes investing in that research upfront helps them cost save for the future. But sometimes organizations are in such a rush to go through that process that for them they're just digitizing it, and I think there's level of that's happening in every organization. And again, if the organization is not investing in research which and thinking holistically, that's the myth. They think that they're advanced and they're digitally transforming, but they're not. I mean, they are digitally transforming, but I guess they are digitizing, but they're not transforming.
Right, right.
Um,
Yeah, so in effect, you're doing a digital version of a broken process, right? Or
yeah,
some experience that is already falling down from a customer
yeah,
standpoint. But you've made it different, but you haven't really fixed the customer problem, essentially,
yeah.
is from what
And
you're
and
describing.
even with this digitizing, what's happening is, a lot of people might be needed to upskill themselves, right? Like when you're deploying a technology solution, a lot of people might fear of losing jobs, but instead, the organization has to think of it differently, and think of it as, they're freeing up space for resource so that they can leverage that resource to do more things, right? And upskill them, or kind of reskill them. So there's a current mindset versus a future focused mindset, right? So
Mm.
I think that's what we miss when we're focused so much on the current and just making it faster by putting technology, versus really thinking of a more futuristic mindset of how is it going to be in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you've mentioned certainly in the video and some of the things that you've talked about, um, the idea of exploration and the importance of exploration and experimentation.
Hmm.
Um, I think I've used the service blueprint in the past. It's a really good one. What are some other tools for exploration and experimentation that you've run into that you think are really useful for folks that they might want to get exposed to?
Yeah, great question. I think one of the biggest, and which we were talking about this morning, actually in another meeting, is this idea of prototyping and early prototyping. And It was a interesting thing came across is this. I think IDEO has this framework where prototypes are of different kinds. There are prototypes for inspiration, inspiring you. There are prototypes to learn, and then there are prototypes to evaluate, right?
Mm,
So I think any organization should take this multifaceted approach where they're not just evaluating. They start from testing, early insights, or even using behavioral prototypes to really understand the user segment, to see how they're going to respond or react and things like that. And then, go into more learning prototypes, which could be paper prototypes, or go to the site and actually do in context, kind of studies with participants of how people might take decisions. When they're actually in context, because some of the decisions could actually affect life, when you're
mhm.
talking about transportation, for example, or healthcare, right? These are some decisions that could actually have very massive impacts. So it's really critical to test and learn constantly. But I think what a lot of organizations struggle with is, what kind of prototyping do I want to do at what stage? Some of them, they'll skip the early two types and then they'll just go into evaluative mode where they've done a design and they will evaluate. And I think UX research is still an evolving profession. Like, there are a lot of organizations don't have UX researchers who can actually do the research at every stage to help them reduce risk. And I think and the reason why a lot of organizations just don't invest in that, because they don't think of it as risk reduction, right? They think of it as, this is, we have to build it and then we have to launch it and see. That's too expensive. I mean,
Right.
if you build the whole thing and then pilot it, that's too expensive for an organization to take that risk and hope people will adopt it, and it will not, it'll fail. It may fail. So better is to invest early. It's basically channelizing your resources or money in a way that you can be more confident about what you release and launch out there.
Absolutely. So I'm going to grab a question from somebody in the audience who's got frankly, a big question for you. And so this is from Diana. I'm going to want to give her credit for this. So she asks, how do we create an organization-wide culture of organization that the human-centered approach, while being mindful of the needs of the business? Is there a route map that you have created for myth busting at top and bottom and everything in between?
I think that's excellent. I think the biggest, and I've thought about this a lot, Diana. I think one thing which is at core of human-centered approach is that people are at the core of your thinking, right? And it applies to business leaders as well as designers and researchers. The problem, what happens is that the designers, researchers are really good at empathizing with their users, the users they're designing for, because they're so passionate about it, right? But they often lack that empathy with the business and the organization and the
Right.
leaders. On the other hand, the business leaders lack the empathy of the customer. And especially when it's a B2B kind of a situation, the distance between the users and the leaders is even more, right? Like, it's greater. So I think one mantra I would say is that we start, educating our researchers, and even when we're onboarding new designers and researchers, we give them some ways in which they can develop that relationship with the business leaders and understand what's keeping them up at night. What are they, how are they making decisions? How can the stuff I'm doing help inform them take a human-centered decision? So, and what kind of storytelling or information, how am I going to translate my empathy with the users to the leaders? Right, I will be in the field for 2 3 months. I
Mhm.
soak in, immerse in the with the users, understand how the operator is working, how this guy is signing and inspecting all the automotives and things like that. But how do you translate that story so that the leaders can feel that same thing? And I think as a designer, our superpowers are visualize, being able to visualize, right, and map things, and make it more visual and tell that story that really connects to those leaders. So Dan, I don't know if I'm going too off track, but I think this is one of the biggest mantras of approaching that disconnect, between business leaders and designers and researchers. Kevin,
I
help
don't think
me
you're off
here.
track at all. And yeah, and I think it's a matter of not just where they're focus on,
Mhm.
on their attention, but understanding and, like you're saying, being empathetic of the
Yeah.
other stakeholders, to really make sure that things can come together, and
and
be innovative.
And I would say one of my best onboarding processes and when I joined Herman Miller many, many years ago, I had to be on site 2 days a week for 6 months. I was based in Chicago and was driving to Michigan. And those 2 days, I wouldn't be in my office or anywhere. I would be back to back with meetings with these business leaders, asking them, "What do you do? What are you thinking? What are your decisions? How are you like, just to know what they're doing and how what they're struggling with, so that I could have a strong business lens when I'm looking at the data from my users to
Hmm.
see what will align with their business strategy, so that I can not only think about innovation and ideas, but I can also inform some of the other decisions that the business is trying to make."
Yeah, I think that's a great perspective. So I want to move on next to another myth, believe it or not, and it's the myth that innovation is that one bright idea, right? That one thing that changes the world and leads you to becoming a billionaire, right? Um, so let me ask you this question:
Mhm.
what's wrong with one bright idea?
Okay, so I don't, so there's nothing wrong with one bright idea, but I think what's wrong is the fact that we romance the one big bright idea. The
Hmm.
romance with what happens in the, when you love somebody so much, you almost everything else is secondary, right? Like, and that's what happens to organizations where there are tons of other ideas that could actually save the business a lot of money and could
Hmm.
be very disruptive many times, or could be very innovative, but they don't do that. So I think the whole point is that um, we need to nurture them. We need to nurture those ideas and not let them fall behind or ignored in the organization. So I think, and that happens from creating a culture in the organization. And to Diane's point, creating a culture where you can empower people to not only identify problems within the organization that could be solved, whether they're internal problems to solve internal processes, or like saving 25 minutes of time for a bank process that can be millions of dollars, right?
Hmm.
That's a different kind of innovation. It's not the disruptive kind, but it is innovation. Like, you're solving a problem that can actually lead to business value, and user value many times, right? So I think that's the key, is to really encourage your organization to identify and empower those people to um, look for opportunities and see where those conversions can be made to bringing value through those ideas. So it's not really back to your point. It's not about the problem with the big bright idea, but I think it's more about that organizations often don't have a mechanism to nurture all ideas, big or small, right?
Absolutely true. So tell me more about the role of stakeholders within these organizations,
Mhm.
to nurture innovation. Like, how do they do that?
Yeah. So I actually we were just talking about this idea of a safe space. You might remember 15 or 20 years ago, Google started saying, 20% of their work time they're going to work on anything they want to, right? In the hope that there will be some ideas that are worth solving for,
Mhm.
right? So I think that's one way of doing it, but I think organizations can first have that, provide that safe space to empower the employees to one, recognize those problems, and then try to find the right stakeholders, make sure they have time to make sure their idea is robust enough to pursue forward. All those things take time, and some of them are just very obvious ideas that could be just implemented. So I think that's what's required. In fact, I did a piece on comparing lean manufacturing to innovation, and I would highly recommend a read on my Medium page. And in that, I interviewed some experts who have been in using lean in many ways. Um, One of the very important things about lean was to have people part of the conversation early on in things that mattered to them, and make them make them feel that if there is a problem, or a human struggle rather, and that was a reframe I learned from my interviews, is that let's think of waste as human struggle. Like if there's a human struggle, we should have the ability to have a conversation about it, and make sure that the employees feel that problems are a good thing, you know.
Right.
So that's one step. The Toyota lean production system, and I think Herman Miller was a big adopter of that. And that's one of the biggest principles about lean, is it's very people centric, and it's really about empowering people to make sure they understand that they have the ability to recognize those smaller problems, and then trying to convert them into opportunities. So I think from a leadership standpoint, I think the leaders have to enable that, encourage that, and make sure they give the incentives to allow for such moments.
I think that's really important. And sort of one of the mistakes that I've seen with organizations, and I won't name them. It's sometimes, let's just have an innovation team,
Yeah,
right? And we'll set them aside and let them do their innovation stuff, and then innovation will just happen.
yeah,
And so I think what you're saying is really important, and it's that organizations need to build their own framework
mhm,
for innovation. Not just happens, but to
mhm,
nurture it, to grow it, and to have essentially a path to where
mhm.
this goes from a seed to a fully developed product that you've got out in the world. And I think, yeah, I've seen kind of both ends of that spectrum.
Yeah, I want to add another point. I think a lot of the organizations also mix up their ideas, like say the big ideas and the small ideas, or
Mhm.
the high risk ideas versus low risk ideas, right? So I think one another technique is to make sure that you separate them. Things that are really incremental and are basic to the business, that can be really fast cash flow ideas. I think you treat them differently because they're more knowns, and maybe you don't have to engage in a lot of research or experimentation, and you just need to execute them. But don't mix them up with other ideas that are high risk ideas and that need more experimentation and exploration. So being more structured about how you run your innovation pipeline is really critical, because otherwise what happens is, and I've seen and been on teams where it's this idea that we're doing, and we're working on, and half the product owner, the product manager, they think of this as a low risk idea, so they just want to design and launch. Whereas as designers and researchers, we know it's not about just digitizing. We need to engage the user, we need to understand what's working, what's not in the process. And research designers are also biased on the opposite spectrum, right? They always want to start from scratch, they always want to do more research. So I think it's really important to take a more ambidextrous approach, where you're exploiting your existing business lines, and you have that bandwidth and safe space to explore new opportunities, which may have different timelines, right? And different kind of agile frameworks that would actually be conducive to that kind of exploration.
No, that's great. And I guess, do you have any recommendations in terms of from an org design standpoint, the low risk versus the bigger high risk? Do you tend to see those in the same innovation organization, or is there a split where different ideas and innovations through different paths?
No, so we did implement some frameworks in one of the organization, and we saw that as long as you recognize and the team recognizes that this is the level of innovation and this is the amount of, so if I don't know if you've seen familiar with the squiggly line of innovation, right?
Mhm.
So it starts from uncertain, unclear, unknown to really focused and high confidence, right?
Mhm.
So what I'm saying is we as a team need to align on where the idea lies. How
Mhm.
ambiguous is it? How much risk does it hold? What are the unknowns? And so in fact there are some frameworks that we used, which is really specific questions that need to be answered, and make sure that when we start a project we know what questions are already answered versus what questions are unknowns that we need to understand and find out. So I think it's more about it doesn't have to be separated, it can be in the same bunch, but as a project the team has to be aligned where that project the idea lies, and where's the right level of research to be done versus not every project, every initiative needs 6 months of research. No, it doesn't.
Right. Exactly. No, that's fantastic. So I want to move to another myth. And since we had a three-way tie, I will exercise my facilitator's right to choose which of the three. And I'd love to dive into the myth, innovation is expensive. So sometimes it feels like large companies have the resources, really the luxury to innovate.
Hmm.
Since this is a myth, how can small companies turn their size into an advantage?
Yeah, I think in the video we use the example of PillPack. I don't know if you're familiar with PillPack. Within a year or so, Amazon bought it, I think, and it was a big success. But I would say a lot of big things happen in small individual groups or
Yeah.
small investments. And I think why they succeed, or when they succeed, they succeed because they start with a human need, right? They
Hmm.
focus on the human need, not run after the fads or the trends, or everybody's talking about machine learning, AI, chatbots, so let's do that. No, they're really looking at the ecosystem or the territory they're playing in, and then looking at what are the adjacent territories they can, with knowing their capability, what else can they do. And a great example is, I know it's a big company still, but Nike reframed, right? It was a shoemaking company till Phil Knights joined back in 2006, I think. And what he did is he came back and said, we're gonna shift our mission statement, and we're gonna say that we want to inspire and empower every athlete around the world. So now they're no more designing better shoes. What they're focusing on is the customer, which is the athlete, and focusing of all the needs around them, and then developing thinking of products. So I think that's one thing, is focusing on human need. I think the other one is really, how much budget you can afford,
Hmm.
invest it wisely, right? Don't, if you have to do decide to do innovation, there are probably many initiatives that can be killed. Right? So one of our chief growth officers in my one of my jobs, he made it really clear. He said, if you want to innovate, let's see what is waste and can be killed, and let's focus those funds into these new initiatives. So that's another way of approaching that. And then one more technique is, again, prototyping. Let's not just pilot and go linear waterfall. No, let's
Mhm.
be agile in the true sense. Like, let's start with really messy, Frankenstein kind of like low fidelity prototypes and test them and see whether there is any potential in that solution. Where and that will actually help you reduce risk. It'll be low budget, and you can really start evolving it, and then be sure and have high level of confidence when you're actually implementing an idea. So, and that doesn't need low fidelity prototypes, do not take a lot of money, right?
Absolutely.
So I think that those are some techniques that I would encourage organizations to think about.
No, that's really good. So with these prototypes, especially the ones that are kind of scrappy,
Mhm.
have you seen organizations do a test where they're essentially doing like a focus group? Or what's the appetite for some organizations to go that next step and say, I know it's not perfect,
Yeah.
but if I can expose it not to the entire marketplace, but a
Mhm.
small number of customers,
Yeah.
where have you seen those lines drawn?
Yeah. So I think again, research at different stages is different, because when you're talking about low fidelity prototypes, you're looking at testing different things, like testing the idea of that product, right? May not be the physical look of the product. And then later on, maybe you're testing, doing a simulation and actually testing how the product works. And maybe you're doing another fidelity level of product where you're actually seeing how people respond to the aesthetics of it. So again, depending on, you have to be very deliberate about what you're testing in that idea, as you go about it. Like, I remember doing, so we have developed a module where we do nothing but 4 week exploration cycles. We do 1 week, just market research background on the brand or the category. We do 1 week, which is doing ideation, just ideas, and then 1 week on really scrappy prototyping. To the extent we do buy off the shelf products, simulate the color and just do a role play, record a video of us doing it, and then show it to the client, right? And then the last one is storytelling. So we actually use a 5E experience model to simulate how a user would, what's the user experience before, during, and after the product life cycle, the use, and all of that. So it's very low investment, 4 week cycle. And then we developed, over the 6 months, we developed, six ideas. And now the organization decided that they're going to take two of them forward, right, to the next stage. And the next stage, then we're going to do more in context studies, take it to people's home and test it. And so again, it depends on what level. Now we have to, those low fidelity prototypes are no longer going to work. So now we have to refine the idea,
Right.
and use it. So there's, yeah, it's really a quick and dirty way of really moving the idea forward. And it's
Th-
low
th-
investment for organizations. You don't need big bucks to do that.
Sure. No, that's fantastic. And what I'd like to do is kind of connect that back to something you mentioned earlier about kind of nurturing innovation.
Mhm.
So since we're talking about the topic, since the topic is really innovation is expensive as a myth, how do your stakeholders in the examples you just gave,
Mhm.
how do they evaluate these different prototypes to decide, well, these two are worth going forward, these other
Yeah.
ones aren't? How do good stakeholders who are nurturing their innovations, how do they measure that?
Yeah, yeah. No, that's a very $1 million question, Kevin. I think it's really important for us when we engage with these clients that it's an interdisciplinary team. So we try to get, sales, marketing, material team, technology team, I don't know, whatever the topic requires. We try to get a multidisciplinary team involved to even share that idea with them. And I think that's where it starts with a gut feeling, right? Because
Mhm.
we're not quantifying, doing quantitative research here. We're not doing, All we know is where the business is headed towards, right? What is the business aspiration for where we want to grow, or what kind of markets we want to grow into, and so far. So I think it's important to have that mixed team that's present, so that they can share and give their input and concerns about their aspect
Hmm.
that could make or break that idea. So we take in that idea to further refine it. So we're not it's really that agile approach we talk about, right? We're there to pivot, not to evaluate the product yet, because it's not there yet.
Right.
And an unfortunate truth, and I see where you're coming from. The unfortunate truth is, leaders, and research says that leaders are more likely to invest in an idea that they know what it is. Maybe it's a crappy idea, but they're still ready to put their money towards that, than the idea that's ambiguous. That's the unfortunate truth. So that's why it's really important that we start with low investment, to move it, take it to the level where they can actually see the potential of that idea. Because, see, as designers, we're great at imagining, but leaders may not be.
Right. Right. Or they'll say, it looks great, it's beautiful, but how can I make money at this, right? Because
Yeah.
it always comes down to that, as you mentioned earlier. So I have one of, everyone's going to be really relieved. I'm almost out of questions for Shilpi. But we just have we have a few extra minutes. So while I ask my last question, anyone who has a question that they'd like to raise, go ahead and drop that in the chat. My colleague Brownrigg is going to be examining that, and he'll help us figure out where the conversation goes next. So Shilpi, the last thing I want to talk about related to innovation is expensive, as is a myth. In the video, which is fantastic, and we'll drop that in a link into the chat as well before we leave, because if you haven't seen that, you need to. One of the things that the video mentioned is this concept of jugaad, which I was not familiar with before. Many of the people in our audience may not be
Yeah.
familiar with it. Just tell us quickly, what is
Yeah.
jugaad and how is it not innovation?
Well, let me clarify that. So jugaad, actually, you can think of it as a hack that is done with scarce resources, and it's a quick fix. So
Hmm.
think of it as a quick prototype to solve a specific problem.
Hmm.
And in India, it's very common, or it's a very known. There's lots of examples of jugaad, or some people call it jugaad innovation. It's really to come up with a creative, quick fix to a problem that needs to be solved. So especially when it comes to social innovation, or in rural parts of the India, where resources are not there, you'll come up with, you'll hack a cycle and connect some machinery in it, and create a pump out of it, right? Like that. Those
Hmm.
are many prevalent examples. In fact, one of my friends wrote a book called Jugaad Innovation, so I would highly recommend you guys read that as well. But in my mind, when we are, all organizations, I think many organizations are at this point where they're trying to scale innovation, right? You can't scale innovation based on a prototype.
Right.
So I highly encourage that Jugaad innovation is a great approach to inspire people, yet that is not innovation. Unless you know how to commercialize something, and kind of scale that, you cannot. So I think that's where the thin line is between Jugaad as an inspiration versus Jugaad as the means to innovate. There's a
Right.
difference.
No, that's great. And it's probably an oversimplification, but I think the American equivalent would be like duct tape is not
Yes,
innovation,
or
right?
workaround, a workaround or a hack.
Yep.
Yeah.
So here's a question. So do you have any insights for why or for what these myths come from? So why are these myths? Is it possible to dig into the root cause that connects all of these myths together?
Root cause. Hmm.
If I can jump in,
Yes.
well, to think about it, I'll give you a second. Is it leadership? Is it the human equation in the system that is risk averse, or um, we get tired of hearing people say, "I'm just not creative." I mean, our whole team is uncreative. We're like, we're gonna have to call BS on that. We're gonna have to call wrong on that. That you are creative, but there's something holding your creativity back,
Yes.
and you're not willing to get that bigger thinking out there in the world. And then the human element plays into the system. So I wonder, just all those 7 myths, they're wonderful. Is there a connective tissue between all of them of where they come from?
Yes, and I think yes, and right. I mean, leadership is often a driver either ways. It's a driver for an organization to be very innovative or not, right? But I think so. Just going back to my point, when I defined innovation as a flow of ideas, I think there's a lot of disruptors in the organization, and there's a lot of bottlenecks which actually run across all of these myths, nicely. And I actually have written an article on that where I say there's 3 big barriers to innovation. One is the organizations being disconnected, right? There's lack of alignment and lack of transparency. And in one of the organization, when I did just research, one-on-one interviews with a lot of stakeholders across the organization, I found there were 7 to 8 customer journey maps across the organization. There were overlaps, but the account manager, the sales team had its own, the design team has its own, the development team had its own. And that's a big problem. That's a disconnected, lack of transparency, siloed kind of a thing. The second one is disbalanced. Organizations sometimes go the startup route saying, oh, we're all going to be entrepreneurs. We're going to implement lean startup thinking in the organization, and we're going to all ideate and come up with ideas. They hire these, or they acquire a design agency to implement that inside, right? Or they're going to be very traditional legacy company where they're still running an R&D model and thinking in that invention kind of right. They're going to invent that new chemistry of that compound that'll break the market. um, and the last one is discordant. There are amazing amount of you know blurriness across organizations that um, really damage the way the organization operates. So, for example, governance issues. So, governance barriers are the lack of process, or hierarchy that prevents people to talk to each other. So, I think there are a lot of governance related barriers that really often inhibit the flow of an idea. So I think those are 3 things, and I can link the article in the chat also. It's actually called "Innovation Goes Beyond New Product Development and Requires a Cohesive Strategy." So yeah.
Fantastic. So I'm just conscious of the time. Any last questions for the folks out there? Okay. Well, so I'm just dropping into the chat here a link to Koj Lab. So I think there's a lot of good stuff there for anybody who's been interested in all that Shilpi's had to say. There's some more good stuff here. I would also like to, well, I guess, Shilpi, I guess any final thoughts, things that you really want people to take away?
Well, I'm curious to hear from the audience, like, what are you challenged by currently in your organization? as one of the biggest things that's keeping you up at night. Like, I would love to hear that.
And Mary Angel, I think there's a hand up.
Yes. Hi, hello everybody.
Hi.
I'm joining from Ecuador. I live here in Latin America. Big fan of the Disruptor Lake. Thank you,
Thanks for
Shilpi. I
joining.
really appreciate all of your material. It's been wonderful. And I wanted to share one of the biggest myth of innovation that I face every day here, since I'm a qualified consultant in lean startup, design thinking, and all that stuff. I've been doing all of my certification in the USA, in Europe, and different kind of countries. But having all that done and making it real in a real consultants here in Latin America, facing the traditional culture of the industry and the companies here, it's the biggest challenge. I mean, I even have a program that it's called people innovation, because it's the easiest way to make them realize that the most important thing is to work on the people's mindset, to have these innovation teams become a real company culture. So how can you advise to have this culture obstacles be in work in a better way?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I think the larger the organization gets, the more challenging it gets. But I think, again, I would take that prototyping approach and work, start with one project, engage the right stakeholders early on in the process. And in that process, you educate, learn from them, treat them as subject matter experts. You need that in innovation. So don't undermine just because they are not trained like you are. Don't undermine their capability. For innovation and people-centric innovation, mutual respect is the most important thing you can do as a designer who's trying to bring change. So I think start with a small project, get excitement and buzz, and then people will want to be part of your team or want to be part of your initiative. So don't try to change the whole organization at once. Start with smaller steps and do it. And it actually works. I did that in one of the organizations where generative research was totally new. It wasn't, all they were doing is surveys. And I started sitting in one corner, starting to design a project. And on one-on-one, I did 0 workshops. One-on-one, I started engaging people, separately, and they felt so heard. They felt so important to be part of that. By the time the initiative was done, the whole organization already knew it. At least the most important people already knew it because they had been part of it. So bringing people early on in the process makes them take your side, right? You want people to take your side because it's theirs, right? It's not yours. So I think as a designer, as a change maker, you need to keep your ego aside and let them be the owners of the work. And I think it really magically works. I was surprised, and I remember I did 6 months of work and I went to India for a vacation. And by the time I was back, the whole organization was talking about it. I'm like, what just happened, and so I left my work with key stakeholders who actually then socialized it throughout the organization. That's what happened. So I think start small. Let's not try to change everyone's mind all at once, and take baby steps.
Thank you.
I think that's great advice, and just understand that you're playing the long game.
Yes.
And just because the people aren't on the same page as you today, bask in the glow of the fact that you're ahead of the curve, but understand that they will catch up eventually.
Yeah.
Sure. Thank you so much. Appreciate
Thanks
it.
for sharing your story. Yeah.
Great. So we are a couple minutes over. I did put a plug into our next thought leader session. It's in about 2 weeks. I'm just going to go ahead and throw this on here so everybody can see the details. So this next one coming up is with Michael Graber, and it's called Innovating Your Organization as If the Planet Depends Upon It. And spoiler alert, it does. So don't miss that one. So Shilpi, thank you. This has been fantastic. I really appreciate all of your insights and your willingness to share. Thanks for everybody who showed up, because I think we've had a good, really great conversation. Some great questions back and forth. Really all I could have hoped. So thanks everybody for making this a great session, and we will see you soon.
Thanks, Kevin. It was wonderfully moderated too. It was enjoyable. Thanks for that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. Cheers, everybody.